Good evening, everyone. I hope most people are joining us without too much difficulty. I think we've got about 60 in at the moment. My name's Callum Sinclair. I'm the project manager for the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, who've organised this event tonight. In advance, and before I forget, a big thanks to our speakers, Craig, Rue and Xavier, who will introduce separately as we go. We have 3 presentations this evening. Each speaker has been challenged to speak for 20 minutes, and we'll allow you to all to be the judge of how well they stick to that brief. I hae my doubts, as they say, but we'll see how we get on. Just to confirm again for everyone, we are recording this session. If you need to leave, you should be able to, we will be able to record this, and we're going to post it up on the website in the next couple of days. So if you miss any of it, or if you have colleagues who wish to see it afterwards, it will be freely available on the project website. If for any reason you happen to be ejected from the premises, so to speak, the meeting room, the waiting room is now unlocked, so you should just be able to re-enter the room by using your previously issued link. So that should be us. The plan tonight is 3 presentations of 20 minutes, covering red squirrels, wildcats and mink. And I'm going to just quickly introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Craig Shuttleworth from the University of Bangor School of Natural Sciences. And I thought I was being a little bit clever here by getting someone not from Scotland to talk about red squirrels, until I found that Craig went to school just 2 minutes away from where I am now sitting in Newton Stewart and Dumfries and Galloway. So the plan to have a Welsh speaker has kind of backfired a little bit, because I've actually gone to someone directly on my doorstep. But anyway, without further ado, Craig, if I can pass the room to yourself, and I will try and make your presentation appear, because we did have a little bit of an issue with that earlier on. So while I'm busking for time, I'll let you open your mic and
Thank you, Callum. Yeah, Callum's going to do my slides for me. I'm going to talk about management complexity, something I challenge my students to think about in one of the field courses. Things are never straightforward, and with red squirrels, certainly they're never straightforward. We have a second one. Okay, so we'll begin with what's a red squirrel. It's always wrong to assume that everybody knows even the slightest bit about some of the common species. So what is a red squirrel? It's native. It weighs, adults weigh about 280 to 320 grams. They live at low densities. They have a home range. They're promiscuous. They're famed through Beatrix Potter for scatter hoarding, for hiding food in the winter months. And they should be really common, but they're not common. And they're not common. Can I have the next slide, Callum? They're not common because of our little friend, the grey squirrel. Now, I can't see the second slide, but I know what it is. What's a grey squirrel? Well, a grey squirrel was introduced from North America in 1876. I guess it's the poster boy for invasive species. It has pushed out red squirrels. It's outcompeted them for resources, but also it carries a virus. It carries Squirrelpox virus. It doesn't show any clinical symptoms itself when it's infected with the virus. But if it was to spread the virus to red squirrel population that's sympatric with it, existing in the same area, then there's a likelihood that animals would develop pathogenic infection, and that infection is spread quite rapidly from red squirrel to red squirrel. So it becomes an epidemic disease. If we look at slide number 4, which I probably won't see either, but I know what it is. It's a map of areas in Wales where we have got red squirrels. And the green area, the island in the top, is Anglesey. And next to it is a hatched area of mainland. And that's where we have a mixed population of red and grey squirrels. There are 2 other sites in Wales with red squirrels. These are both coniferous. One's Cyclinog in northeast Wales, and the other is a complex of conifer forests in mid Wales. If we look at slide number 5, I tell you what, look, just because we're up against time yet, let me just, if you can see that picture of the red squirrel, Let me just wing on and talk a bit more about it, because I obviously I know this stuff back and forwards. So we've got red squirrels, then we've got grey squirrels, and we've got an island, North Wales, which is one of three focal areas, key areas for red squirrel conservation. That island has got red squirrels on it, not by design, but through a lot of hard effort in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So an eradication took place there, an eradication of a boundary. What we didn't realize was that, I mean, it was silly thinking about it. What we didn't realize was that the way in which grey squirrels, one of the ways in which grey squirrels got onto the island in the 1960s was the bridge, probably the lower deck of the Britannia Bridge. And that's still there. And in 2009, red squirrels decided to leave the island and colonize the mainland. So we now have this fluid population over the Menai Straits. The moat that guarded the castle no longer works. And that means that red squirrels come into contact with grey squirrels. This is important because in 2014, Pia Schuchert published a paper looking at grey squirrel culling on Anglesey. And one of the key things that she was able to show was that as you culled out a population, the remaining animals that were left, these grey squirrels that were still in the environment, there was a tendency for less and less of them to have antibodies to squirrelpox virus. This was the test that we were using at the time, antibodies. And eventually we found in the latter stages of the eradication, the remaining grey squirrels had no antibodies. So the virus had burned itself out. On the mainland, 200 yards away, grey squirrels are ubiquitous and they have lots of antibodies. So you might find 70% of them have antibodies. So red squirrels moving across the straits is a big deal. And they didn't just move across the straits and stay there. They moved out up to 15 kilometers, the odd individual. Nevertheless, this is important because we've got mixing of the red squirrel population with the mainland grey squirrel population. And that means a risk of squirrelpox. And it doesn't just mean a risk of squirrelpox to the animals that are resident on the mainland. There's a potential for red squirrels, because it's a fluid population, for red squirrels to move back across the Menai Straits onto Anglesey and bring infection with them. So it's greatly complicated things. In 2017, we found the first pox outbreak on the mainland. It started with one individual. We got it tested. We used a variety of tests, PCR tests, and also an electron microscope to determine the virus was actually present in the lesions that develop in red squirrels once they're infected. And probably about 2 weeks later, we found a second individual. There was a third animal, and I never found the body. We searched for that, we didn't find it. And so we'd had this small-scale outbreak. In parallel with that, the same time period, we had 2 animals on Anglesey, one right next to the bridge, which also had skin lesions. And they looked very much like they could be pox. We sent them away and they were pox negative. And this is where one of the confounding things comes in. We end up with a situation where we have animals that have other skin conditions at the same time as a pox outbreak. Can I just stop and check? Have you got pictures of a grey squirrel on the screen just now, or is it not moved? Not moved. Okay.
Not moved.
So we've got animals with different skin conditions. I mean, there are a couple. Staphylococcus aureus infections look very much like pox, and that's what it was on the Anglesey side of the Straits. Then in 2020, we found a squirrel that we, again, on the mainland, we thought had squirrelpox in it. Prior to that, in June, we had marked large numbers of animals on the mainland for the first time. We then came back and trapped again in October, and we found still significant numbers of red squirrels present. But when we get through to March of 2021, of the animals that were present in June, there's only 17% that we can find. And of the animals that were present in October, caught in October, we can only find, I think it was 14%. The other animals we can't find them. And not just can't find them in March, but we trapped through 2021 through until September. So they're not just missing once, they're missing at multiple interventions, trapping interventions. And that almost certainly means that they were lost. Now, we can't say that, because this is an opportunistic study, we can't say that there was not other types of mortality taking place. There may well have been. We can't rule out that some animals might have dispersed, because red squirrels do disperse. But when you look at the published literature, what you don't get, apart from in Ognev in the 1940s, you don't tend to get massive migrations of red squirrels. If they've got a home range established, one might conclude that it's in the animal's interest to maintain that range. It knows the range, it knows the sources of food supply, good sources. It's got nests, it's got resources. It's part of a hierarchy. It may well be the dominant animal. And so having a large chunk of animals missing is extremely significant. We were sort of confounded, though, by a couple of things. The first was during lockdown, cameras that we were using to monitor the population were stolen, and volunteers felt at times intimidated by some of the, well, I'm not saying hostility, but it was a challenging environment to work in, given that people were going off of the main footpath into areas that should be private. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that part of the mainland is actually a shooting estate, and the keeper at the time, it's his livelihood, it's his decision, was uncomfortable about people being in during the pheasant shooting season, and this meant that we couldn't access a particular area. So when I say that we were trapping and monitoring animals, the population, we were partitioning it out. The percentage of residents, if you like, the residual, the potential survivors, we could only measure what was caught within accessible woodlands in June and October, and then what turned up later. There were other parts of the estate we couldn't go into, and there was probably about 10 or 11 red squirrels that were in that site. So if you could see it, I had a graph, a figure, where I was showing this mass of dots, imagine open circles representing animals that were missing. We shaded those in where the animal was resident in an area we could no longer go to. Effectively, we discount them. And then we looked to see what's left, what animals were left in March of 2021. And we found 4. And it's quite a small sample. It fits with the pattern of epidemic disease that you see in severe outbreaks. There's a couple of good illustrations. One would be Tollymore in Northern Ireland. Dave Tosh was working there, and the other is the fantastic work done by Julian Chantry at Formby, which has had repeated outbreaks. Fairly substantial. You might be looking at 80 to 90% of your population lost in a major outbreak, and they tend to roll on. And in our 2020 example, the last animal that was found with pox was caught in January of 2021. This is about 3 months after the first individual had been discovered. One thing we'll never know is whether that was a discrete transfer and cross-infection from a grey to a red squirrel, or whether it was part of a background ongoing rumbling red-to-red transmission. We don't know that. This particular study, we also had to make a decision when we were trapping animals during a pox outbreak. Is it wise to be handling and stressing animals? So we tended not to handle animals that were chipped, microchipped, and which didn't show any signs that we had concerns about that might invite a more closer examination. We did microchip animals that we caught that were unmarked. Again, they were examined. We didn't find any lesions on any animals apart from this one individual in January of 2021. So another question that comes to mind is, you've got these pox survivors, or the animals which have persisted during this outbreak. They're obviously still resident there. That gives us that indicates that the mainland population is not simply there because of ongoing immigration movement from Anglesey onto the mainland, that there is a residual left there after pox. But what we couldn't do was blood sample. We'd need a Home Office license for that. So unfortunately, we couldn't blood sample the animals we caught to test for antibodies. But even if we could have, it gets more complicated because Tony Sainsbury in 2008 published a paper where they found a small proportion of animals, red squirrels killed by trauma, let's say road casualties, etc., in areas where greys persist. A small proportion of them show antibody response, a positive antibody response. And that's interesting because those animals didn't show any signs of disease. Infection had obviously occurred. Whether the infection had died out, didn't take hold, or whether the animal had a degree of resistance, unsure. We're unsure about. But we do have some information elsewhere in North Wales from a squirrel released in a translocation from the Welsh Mountain Zoo in Colwyn Bay back in the late 90s, Foxley. And that animal developed squirrelpox infections, so the lesions were there, the secondary infection was present. It was treated with antibiotics. They didn't have any antiviral, but it was treated with antibiotics to fight the secondary infection, and it survived, and the lesions healed up. When the lesions healed up, there had already been a blood sample taken when the animal was first brought to the hospital, to the quarantine unit at the Welsh Zoo. When the lesions began to heal, obviously the animal was blood sampled again, and again, it's still got a high level of antibodies. But in the next 18 months, it lost all its antibodies. So one has to wonder whether or not the animal had a degree of resistance because it had an antibody response. And when I talk to lots of virologists about this, people are uncertain about what that means. And some viruses, an antibody response, which then disappears, you can still have immunity. It's complicated, but you can still have immunity. In others, the absence of antibodies means you don't have an immunity. So there's lots of research to be done. What we've learned is that there's not much we can do about squirrelpox, or is there? And one of the last slides I was going to show was some work that we had commissioned last year. We commissioned Heriot-Watt University, Peter Lertz, and Andy White to look at pine marten translocation and the impact of pine marten upon red and greys, modelling pox present, pox absent. And the models pick levels of pine marten predation on grey squirrels. So we might have low, medium, and high. And then the models are run repeatedly over a 40-year period. And what we find in those models, which hopefully will be published, we're preparing a paper about this, but hopefully published at some point. What we find in the model is that where you've got medium and high levels of pine marten impact on grey squirrel, you get this landscape change. But there's some subtle things going on. It doesn't stop Anglesey from being reinvaded by grey squirrels. They do get back on. And so there's always this risk of pox virus. Similarly, you can't stop all pox outbreaks. But when you look at squirrelpox, the presence of pine marten is projected to reduce the levels or the probability of squirrelpox outbreaks. And so in a way, in the future, although it's a long way in the future, pine marten potentially could have a significant impact here and remove this nightmare scenario of endless intervention, challenging conditions, expense, and heartbreak, because it is heartbreaking for the volunteers who've spent so much time monitoring red squirrels to suddenly see this runaway train where pox comes in and there's virtually nothing we can do. The single animal that we caught with infection was treated but died within a few hours. It was quite clear it wasn't going to survive. And the other animals we've had, the majority have been, of the 6 other cases that we've had confirmed, the majority have been dead animals. Again, there was a single animal at the beginning of 2017 which had caught and had lesions, but but that died too. So the message is complexity. We've got to look for solutions. We've got pine marten translocation underway at the moment, which is small scale. Hopefully that could be increased. And then lastly, we've got to hope that we get, if it's not pine marten, that we get some assistance here from a couple of other things you may have heard about. The first is gene drive, which is being worked on by scientists in Edinburgh. And the second is potentially the use of IMC, immunocontraceptive. My preference is pine marten because they're a lot of fun. Gene drive's nice, but IMC means lots of legwork and putting out hoppers, etc., which is no different than what we do just now with traps. But my preference would be the other two. So that would have been my talk. Forgive me for the technical difficulties.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Can we just ask you to take your slides down, and to say thanks very much for sort of managing to get through that presentation. Apologies to everyone who's listening to this, and it is absolutely more difficult to follow a presentation without images, but I think luckily Craig has very clearly presented his work for us. What I'm going to suggest is that we will post the presentation up on the website alongside the recording of this evening's presentation, so that if you're keen to go back and revisit this and see some of the brilliant images of grey squirrels making swims for it across Anglesey, then there's some really nice images in that presentation, all of which is useful to you because you can't see them. There's a couple of questions coming in regardless, so Craig, which I'm going to ping to you. One's from Callum from NatureScot, a colleague in NatureScot. How is it known that the missing squirrels were missing? Were they marked, or were the animals caught, microchipped, or is there anything you can clarify on actually how you know that they were just off the radar for you?
They're all pit tagged, so each one has a unique transponder put in the scruff of the neck under license. And there's biometrics taken too, some skeletal measurements and body weight and obviously sex. So each animal has a few different types of data collected from it.
Okay, thanks for that. That's the only question that's coming at the minute, which I'm not surprised about. But what I was, okay, here's one. What is the best way for the average person to help red squirrels? I guess that might depend on where they are. And I think you've sort of outlined some of the challenges, but I don't know if you've got any sort of generic advice that might help someone who's trying to make the best support for red squirrels, assuming they have them in their neighbourhood. What would be the do's and don'ts, Craig?
Well, I think there's a ton of stuff online. That'd be the first port of call, was have a quick Google and have a look around. That search will bring up your local conservation project. It might be a national one, it might be a small volunteer group, volunteers, etc. And then it really depends what you're minded to do. If you're interested in cameras or these remote chip readers, these ARFIDs, they're a lot of fun. Killing grey squirrels not exactly a fun thing to do, but in some circumstances it's essential. So if that is something that you're skilled at, you might already be skilled at that with an air gun, etc. And then there's habitat management. If you're in an area where there's no red squirrels, you can still support their conservation by spreading the word. Just again, learning about them online and sharing your views and experiences with other people. You're on mute, Callum.
Callum, you're muted.
I thought I had unmuted, apologies. For those that are in Scotland, I've just put a link in the chat box to the Scottish Red Squirrel Conservation Project, which has got lots of information about local volunteer opportunities and the actions that they're taking, and opportunities for people to get involved with those groups that are dispersed, from north to south across Scotland. But I think Craig's advice is, have a look around and see what's local to you. I guess most of pretty much all the red squirrel actions happening in Wales or Scotland, with some bits and bobs in England. But do have a look around and see what you can find out there, because they're certainly a species worthy of your help and support. Okay, I'm going to suggest that if there's any further questions, we stick them in the chat box, and maybe Craig and I can check through those as they come through when the next presentation's on. But of course, now you have no idea how many fingers I've got crossed for this next presentation to work through. So please, please make those slides appear, and please, hopefully everyone can see them. While Rue's coming off mute and hopefully putting these slides up, I'll do a reintroduction. Rue Campbell's a colleague of mine in NatureScot, who's a mammal advisor, previously the project manager for Scottish Wildcat Action. So really, if there's someone who knows things about Scottish wildcats, then Rue's certainly one of, if not the man. So I'm delighted to say I can see those slides. I hope everyone else can. I really, really hope everyone else can. But I'm going to go to mute and pass the floor to you, Rue, and off you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Callum. Just give me a yell if you can't hear me. I seem to be off mute. So, yeah, everything went so smoothly in the lead up to this, and then it all fell over. But this is good, going well so far. Thank you for everybody for joining and attending this today and listening to our talks. Yeah, today I'm talking about genetic invasion in cats. So I decided to try and give it an invasive species theme, given the forum that we're on. And as Callum says, I'm a mammal advisor for NatureScot, but I used to also, while the Scottish Wildcat Action Project was running, I was project managing the field side of that. So, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today actually draws on the work there that we did. So we had 5 years of work working to conserve wildcats, and a few years before in the lead up to it as well, where we gathered an awful lot of data, and it really helped us get important insights into the status of the wildcat in Scotland, which has helped us move on to the next step, which I'll mention at the end. So today I'm going to talk about, I'll give you a little bit of a potted history about the wildcat in Scotland, and as you must all know by now, I'm sure because it's been talked about so much. Wildcats are suffering hybridisation issues with domestic cats. So I'm going to talk about the drivers of hybridisation, spatial patterns, that what happens following a hybridisation, and ask the question very briefly. I'm not going to get too deep into it. Ask the question: are hybrids actually non-native invasive species, or are they saviors of the wildcat? And I also add a little dictionary term there. So introgression, I might start talking about introgression at some point. Introgression, when we talk about hybridization, introgression is really just when you've got quite a complex hybrid situation where you've got hybrids then going and mating with the parent species, one of the parent species, and therefore back crossing, or hybrids even mating with other hybrids, and then you get quite a complex pattern emerging. So that's called introgressive hybridization. Right. What is a wildcat? That's always a good to start with. So this, the wildcat is a European wide species. It's our small native felid from Europe. It used to be classed with other felids in Africa and Asia as the same species, but actually it's been recently reclassified as its own species. The Scottish wildcat, though, is just a population of the European wildcat. This is on the left. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the left, this is a cat from Spain. It looks extremely close to one of our Scottish wildcats. Here's a cat from Germany. It looks a little bit different, but they're all part of the same species. Now they're a bit larger than a typical domestic cat, so about 1 kilo heavier on average. So it's about 20% bigger, running up to maybe 7 kilos, maybe for a large one, and that's a large male. And they live in across Europe, but actually they're only in Scotland. That's by far the most northerly outpost for the wildcat in Europe. So it's quite striking. You might see a map later where I show a European distribution for wildcats, and it's quite striking how far north they are in Scotland. So in mainland Europe, they're really like Germany is, but as far north as you go. So and this is there is a typical Scottish wildcat, just to show you. So they all look pretty similar actually. So what happened to the wildcat in Scotland? Well, actually, it's a British wildcat. It was once found throughout Britain, and its range declined over centuries. So it was still found in England and Wales in the 1800s, and then through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, persecution, probably the main driver actually, meant that the population shrank further and further until eventually it was only found effectively in the far northwest of Scotland, north of the Great Glen. And then around about, so then the First World War broke out, and then that meant that a lot of the folk who would have been involved with predator control on estates in Scotland were sent off to the trenches. Not many of them returned. It was a big perturbation in the human population. It led to a perturbation, I suppose, in the wildcat population, and the population recovered and expanded, and presumably at some point it began to meet domestic cats as it expanded out. And that's an obvious question mark about the hybridisation that we'll address later. But anyway, certainly within a few years, a few decades, the wildcat was found across Scotland, across northern Scotland, north of the Highland boundary fault this time. So that's all the Highlands and Aberdeenshire and around there. So, and Argyll. Meanwhile, persecution was still ongoing. So it was perfectly legal at this point. So we had large numbers of cats being killed in estates throughout Scotland. And the cats can be quite productive, but these were still significant numbers. And that was true. That was from in the mid 80s. That was still going on. And then in 1988, they were protected as an amendment to the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Whether that changed what was happening in the ground is impossible to say, but one presumes it had some influence in reducing the risks at that point. So a little primer on what the difference between a domestic cat and the wildcat is. I've said they're larger, the wildcat's larger. You can spot the difference through a pelage scoring system that was developed because we realized that there was hybridization going on with wildcats. So, and the most obvious feature being the blunt banded tail on the wildcat, but it's also more stripy rather than spotty, and it's got stronger markings in the nape and no dorsal line going down the tail. So that's the two extremes. You've got a tabby domestic and a tabby wildcat there. And then you've got hybrids that look intermediate. So they might have some of the features of both cats. And that was our ideal here on our left is our idealized what a hybrid might look like. But in fact, of course, hybrids look like just about anything. So this is a selection of hybrids that I was catching prior to the Scottish Wildcat Action Project starting. And these are all hybrids. So we genetically confirmed all these as hybrids, but they're the full spectrum of pelage types. It certainly makes conserving them very difficult because you often don't know what you're dealing with. So one has to assume that if it looks like a wildcat, it is a wildcat, and then get on with it. So these are the phenotypes, so how the cats looked from the project, from Scottish Wildcat Action. So we sampled cats. Obviously, we worked, or you may not be aware, but we worked in 6 and then laterally 5 priority areas. So there's lots of samples from those, and a few ad hoc collected as roadkills from other locations as well, like for example in the far north, and we classed them based on how they look. And then the public reported cats as well to us, over 700 cats, in fact, over the project reported to us, and we classified those depending on how confident we could be, and a small number, about 40 of them, we thought we were confident enough to say these look like wildcats. So that's the distribution there. You'll notice a few things. One is that there's no cats detected in the far north of Scotland, no wildcats that is. And the other is we did detect some hybrids in Galloway, Dumfries and Galloway. Certainly they look like hybrids anyway, and possibly they got there because of some quiet releases in the 80s of wildcats, but it could also be from escaped pets actually, to be honest. So that was the pattern in Scotland. What's the pattern in the rest of Europe? So here's, as I mentioned before, the range of the wildcat in Europe. And of course, you've got this outlying population in Scotland that would have been connected through England to the rest of Europe, but is now this isolated population up here. So wildcat is the blue splodges, and then all the other ones are some form of hybrids. So you can see actually that throughout most of Europe, hybridization is actually pretty low. The levels of hybridization run from 3 to 10% of the population. So that's a fraction of the near 100% hybridization level that we have in Scotland. So it begs the question, what on earth is going on in Scotland? Why is it so bad here? So the most obvious hypothesis, or I think anyway, is that there must be lots of unneutered pets and strays and feral cats running around Scotland, and that they then interbred with the wildcats at some point and led to this hybrid situation. That photo on the left there is actually a cat in Romania. So I went for a trip to Romania a few years ago, and I couldn't help noticing that all the farms there have they have farm cats and pet cats, and none of them are neutered. And if we go back to the map here, the Romanian population of wildcats is doing brilliantly, thank you very much. So there's, in fact, among the lowest levels of hybridization anywhere in the range. And this is the same across Europe. There's no reason to think that Scotland's got a particular problem with feral cats any more than any other country. The other obvious hypothesis is that the range expansion of wildcats in Scotland led to hybridization at that point. That was the working hypothesis we had when we started. And then there is evidence from Europe that this does happen. So Nussberger looked at the genetics of cats in expanding population in France and into Switzerland, and they found where all these little crosses are. They found around the periphery of the range, you got hybridization events occurring, but not in the middle. And they modeled it and did some fancy stats, and it seemed that the integration, because of the expansion of the range, was the most plausible explanation for the pattern they were seeing there. However, in Scotland, we don't really have evidence for this at all, actually. So if you look at this is a graph that shows, this is a graph that shows the frequency of cat samples or carcasses that were collected before and during the project from 1885 to 1959. So we've got, this is based on phenotype, how they look. This is domestic cats, hybrids, lots of wildcats. 1960s to 1995, we get a more even distribution. So there's quite a lot of hybrids, fewer wildcats. And then more recently, we get almost no wildcats and a lot more hybrids and domestic cats. Now, the way this data has been collected does vary slightly. So we have to be a bit tentative, but it does certainly look like there has been a change in the population, in the proportion of wildcats, and that this change seems to have happened a little bit later than the range expansion that I was talking about. I'm just going to, there we go. And in fact, the genetics also confirms this as well. So if we look at the genetics, we've got, just look at the green dots here. We've got the genetics of historical cats taken sampled from 1895 to 1987. So this is quite late on, and they're almost all of them are high quality genetics. So the genetic value is on the left-hand axis here, the x-axis. That's from domestic cat 0 to wildcat 1. And then that's the phenotype, but don't worry about that too much. So they're all pretty good. And then the cats we sampled before the SWA project started, they actually showed quite a range of hybridization levels. So the main message, I think, is that, and also there's another study by Howard McComb that estimates that actually the onset of hybridization started only 3 and a bit generations ago. So that's as little as 10 years potentially, so it's recent. But the key point is that somewhere anyway between the 60s and the 90s, hybridization accelerated. There may have already been some hybrids around, but it really took off in the last few decades, which has led to today's situation. So this is the current situation of integration in wildcats in Scotland. So that's the genetic score again on the left, domestic cat 0, wildcat 1. This is the different priority areas we worked in. And you can see there's virtually no wildcats at all. They're all hybrids. There's quite a lot of domestic cats in Strathbogie in particular, because there was lots of farm cat sampled as part of the neutering program. And then 2 potential wildcats, but actually these genetic samples are partial results only. So we have to be a bit cautious about these up here. So this cat here on the top right, for example, is a cat from Morven. That's just, looks like a wildcat, but it's somewhere in, it's probably this one of these 2 cats here. So it's just, again, the genetic score suggests it's just a hybrid, so maybe an important one. So there's no evidence then that the wildcats hybridized as the range expanded out in Scotland after the First World War. So maybe it's landscape structure that encourages interactions in some ways. So that could be habitat, it could be human settlement pattern. Maybe the villages and houses in Scotland are more dispersed throughout the landscape, and there might be some evidence for that. But also could be predators, would be predators of cats. So here's a a still of a video. I've combined 2 frames actually showing domestic cat getting chased by lynx. This is a sheep protecting dog that again from Romania. Those sort of dogs are free ranging and are likely to be significant risk factors to roaming domestic cats. And this is a typical environment in parts of Central Europe where you've got settlements, but also large areas of forested ground. So it's a very different landscape structure out there. Compare that with, this is Strathbogie area. So we've got loads of farmland with, yes, there's a large patch of forest here, but that forest wasn't there 80 years ago. That's a new forest that's been planted up. So it's a very different type of landscape we're dealing with. And there's a researcher called Pedro Monterosso who did some analysis of genetic integrity across Europe. And he found 3 things that were general, which was that the integrity of the forest was important. And that means how its conservation value as opposed to how as opposed to the tree cover that comes with it. Distance settlements and but not necessarily legal landscape protection. So really the key factors were settlement pattern and habitat. There may be something else that's going on, and that is the wildcat population in Scotland was small and fragmented at some point after the population minimum in 1915. And we've got evidence that this does lead to integration in other species. So this is wolves. This is the wolf in the last wolf, in fact, in the Sierra Morena in Spain. It was collected as a roadkill, and they did the genetic analysis on it, and they found it was heavily hybridized with domestic dogs. And this is found in several places throughout Europe. Actually, you see this pattern of hybridization occurring with wolf as well. There's another example here of salmon in Norway, actually, and it's potentially more similar to domestic cat situation and wildcats in Scotland, because salmon farmers' escape in Norway could swamp genetically the wild population, which is always a fear, really, in Scotland, that's what happened to the wildcats in Scotland. They were just simply swamped by all the domestic cats. But actually, they looked at it and they found, sure, the frequency of escaped farmed salmon did have some relationship with the introgressive rate in the wild population, but it wasn't very good, actually. And they found a much better model also included the annual catch weight of the salmon in the population, which basically relates to the population size. So smaller populations had basically higher levels of hybridization after farm salmon escaped. So I think we can put to bed fairly safely that the World War I range expansion of wildcats led to hybridization, but actually all the other ones are still in the running as potential drivers for hybridization in Scotland. And I think from that we must ask, was there a second population decline? And that may have been driven by improved predator control techniques like lamping, for example. And then was this second decline against a backdrop of a changed landscape? So was there landscape features that really didn't support wildcats or led to more contact between wildcats and domestic cats? And I think that could be quite possible too. The changes in agricultural practices since the 60s have meant that probably farmers support fewer wildcats than they used to. And there's maybe more pet cats around the environment now than there used to be. So, given that we've got that situation, what does this mean for the hybrids that we've got in our landscape? Well, one of the things we noticed from our work in Scottish Wildcat Action was that as soon as we moved away into slightly wilder land, we didn't catch any feral cats anymore. There's no such thing as a feral cat really in Scotland, in the north of Scotland. The former wildcat range, if you come across a cat and it's miles away from a house, then it's probably a hybrid, or it might be just a might be a wildcat, but it's probably a hybrid. So this is our data from the project, and this is the distance from an inhabited building in meters. So that's 0 to, it's about 2.7 kilometers was the furthest we collected a sample from. And then this is genetic score again. You've met this already. So 0 for domestic cat, 1 for wildcat, and then I've even color coded them so you can see this is our classification. So we've got domestic cats at the bottom near habitations, a whole swathe of hybrids that basically there's a slight positive trend but it's really difficult to say what's going on for their genetic scores to increase with distance from settlements, and there are a couple of potential wildcats, but these are these samples that we're not sure about up here. And here's a perfect illustration as well from this was actually a BBC article a few years ago. Chris Usher was up in Lochnagar, and in this image somewhere there's some kittens, and I can't see them, so we'll zoom in as Chris did with his video. And it's what looks like potentially a wildcat kitten, and you would think 800 meters up on a mountain, you think that's got to be a wildcat. It's got to be a wildcat. But then, when we continued the video, we clocked this thing here, which doesn't look. This is the back of a cat, and it doesn't look particularly wildcatty at all. And in fact, it's a blotchy tabby. And this is a similar blotchy tabby we get in the Angus Glens, not very far from Lochnagar, and it's a very typical coat pattern of hybrids in Angus actually, and probably so stretching up to Lochnagar as well. So this is 6 kilometres from a nearest house, 800 meters up. That's as basically as far and as remote as you can get in Scotland, really. And there is hybrids up there breeding happily and probably feeding on water voles. So this leaves us with an issue in dealing with it, because managing hybrids that live 6 kilometres away at 800 meters up is difficult. And in fact, we recorded, or I gathered data from our work with Scottish Wildcat Action and looked at our trapping effort. And our best year, which was our second year, because that was the year we were really going for wild living cats for neutering, our best effort, we were managing 19 trap nights per cat. So that's basically like leaving a trap out for a month, given that we can only work during weekdays because the vets are usually closed at weekends. So that's a month's worth of work per cat, per trap. So that's an awful lot of work. And that was, we calculated at that time, it was costing us something like £1,000 per cat to then trap that. So that's a massive, massive issue to deal with. So we have to ask then, did the hybridisation save the wildcat? I did promise I would address this question. It's certainly possible that the wildcat would be extinct in Scotland right now if it wasn't for hybridisation. Because without the increased diversity of genes from the domestic gene pool, I think we might have gone through a situation where we had highly inbred and very fragmented population that just died out naturally, as it may have done in the north of Scotland, actually. But my worry is that the genome is ever shrinking. So we've got genetic scores from 2 very close time periods, admittedly, and I can see that the peak genetic score has recently declined slightly, but it's not very significant. That's our significance level. It's not significant at all, really, but that's within a couple of years. We're not going to see much change. But there's a study by Howard McComb who suggested that there was a 13% rate of change in every generation, so that's every 3 years. So we could be seeing a tendency for the cats to become less and less wildcat and more domestic cat. So hybrids currently, I think, fill a niche. But I also worry that we're going to, because the breeding barrier has potentially been removed between domestic cats and what are now hybrids often, is that we're seeing a continued decline in the proportion of wildcats in the genome, and that will always happen unless we were to able to neuter it, every single feral domestic pet and farm cat in the north of Scotland, which is a really tall order actually. So I feel we need to reintroduce the breeding barrier at some point, which would mean managing some of these hybrids, even though it's a very costly affair. So the key points I wanted to make then was that the wildcat declined, but then recovered, and it was all right actually. But then hybridisation suddenly took off in between the 60s and 90s, and that's likely following a second population decline. And that basically this population decline, low wildcat numbers, and also maybe the landscape structure in Scotland at the root of hybridisation. Pet cats are just another factor that we have to deal with. So now there are too few wildcats left to form a sustainable population, and therefore a reintroduction or reinforcement is needed, and that is starting as we speak with Saving Wildcats project, which I'll provide a web link later. And the other point is that hybridisation has allowed the domestic cat genes to percolate through the landscape in a way that may have not happened without hybridisation at all. So if we were to go to a time before hybridisation occurred, we might not have found domestic cats very far in the landscape. I don't think I've got time to talk. Callum, how long have I gone for? Do you know? I've lost track of my time.
You've gone for 20, but you've probably got another 5 minutes if you want.
Have I stuck to time? That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm surprised. But by the way, if you want another 5 minutes,
Yeah, it was just an extra slide. I thought it was about hybridisation patterns in the population, and I thought this was quite interesting actually. Nussberger, working in who I mentioned earlier, actually was talking about who studied hybridisation patterns in Central Europe, noticed that basically the hybridisation integration you get in the nuclear DNA is 17 to 18%, and it's very similar in the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down by the female line, but it's much lower in the Y chromosomes. And that means that male wildcats aren't contributing. How do I get this the right way around, actually? Yes, so have I got this the right way around? I always get myself confused when I go through this bit. There's basically a sex bias in the integration rate in wildcats, which we noticed actually with our mitochondrial measure here as well in the population, where we see here at the bottom is genetic score of the cats. So we've got grouped into 4 each quarter of the genetic score. So 0 to 25, that's basically domestic cat, and 75 to 1, that's pretty much wildcat. And then in between, we've got increasingly more wildcat type of genetic scores. And this is the mitochondrial DNA score. And we see that actually a very large number of the mitochondrial DNA from the cats that are better are a disproportionate number are from wildcat, which means that the male wildcats are contributing less to this pattern than you'd think. So the typical pattern you'd expect, or you would think, would be that a male wildcat goes in and it beats up a male domestic cat, and then it breeds with the female domestic cat. But actually, the other way around is what's happening. It's certainly happening with our data. I think it's happening with Nussberger's data, and it also happens with. It was noted actually in a recent study looking at wolf-dog hybridization in Europe as well, in Europe and Asia. So I thought that's really interesting, and we were scratching our head about it as a project actually, because we thought, why would that be? That's the opposite from what you'd expect. You'd expect the big strong male wildcats to beat up and basically dominate and take all the mating opportunities with the female domestic cats. But we thought maybe it was sperm competition. That was my theory, because of course because domestic cats are more gregarious, there's more sperm competition in males, so they may actually have more competitive sperm. But it could also be that there's a male-based mortality in wildcats, because more male wildcats get killed on the road than female wildcats, and generally more male cats get killed on the road. So there is in terms of cats living wild, there is certainly a greater mortality for males. But actually, there's a very simple explanation for it all, and that's what I'd call the birthplace effect. So a male wildcat that breeds with a female domestic cat, that female domestic cat is much more likely to give birth to kittens in a home or near a home, and those kittens will then get taken into the human population, the pet population. Whereas it's the opposite, the other way around. If a male wildcat contributes to a female with a female, a male domestic cat mates with a female wildcat, then those kittens are born in the wild, and we sample them as a project. So I don't think there is a bias in integration. I think there's a bias in how we detect it, and we detect it in the wild, and we see a bias. But actually, there's a population of, and we know, in fact, there's a population of pet hybrids as well, forming the other end of the spectrum. So I think that's quite a curious side effect of what's going on. And that was the end of my talk. But I will show you a video briefly. I'll just say thanks to the funders actually for Scottish Wildcat Action, the partners as well, and in fact all the volunteers and staff who contributed, because there's an awful lot of data collected during the project that really shone light on what's going on. And I'll finish with this is when I talk about predation risk in Europe might affect how cats behave in the wild. I think this video shared from a CCTV shared through the Euro Wildcat Network might be interesting. It's what happens when a lynx meets a domestic cat. Let's hope it works. I'll play that again so you can see it. I think it's fantastic. I just hope that pet cat, I really hope it didn't have one of those cat flaps that has a chip thing on it, because they're really difficult to get through. It needs a quick exit, that cat does. anyway, thank you very much for listening.
Ruth, thanks very much for that. And I've never been so grateful to see some slides appear on the screen for quite some time. So thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions coming in, I think. First one is really about the captive breeding programme. And I guess I appreciate it's still quite early within that programme, but the question is, is the captive breeding programme helping? And maybe the extension of that would be, what is the likelihood of it going to be able to help, and what sort of help do you think it's going to deliver to this conundrum?
Yeah, that's I shared the URL actually to the project at the end, but I didn't actually highlight it. So savingwildcats.org.uk. So the captive breeding programme is during Scottish Wildcat Action. It was being built and it's established and settled really. And then the new Saving Wildcats project's job is to then convert that into a programme that can be released, so the cats can be released, and they're already on that. So they've built these enclosures. And they've got to populate those enclosures with cats, and it's the offspring of those cats that get released. So it's a multi-step process. I believe it's the only real way we're going to solve this issue actually in Scotland, because we've got a population, such a vast sea of hybrids to deal with virtually no wildcats left amongst them, and most of the wildcats that are left will have some level of introgression somewhere. So we've got, whereas the captive population, has got very low levels of introgression. So they're really, really good, actually, genetically, they're very good. So we're going to have to do this release. That will be done in stages. So over the next 2 or 3 years, Saving Wildcats will hopefully do its first release of wildcats. And that will then be done in a certain area, and then that's got to be in the Cairngorms. And then once we've established that the method works, then that's going to have to be expanded out more widely, and that's when we've got to have a real head scratch over how we manage. It's a bigger project, it's larger numbers, but we're going to have to manage hybrids as well when we deal with that, or decide what we're going to do and how we manage these hybrids, and that's going to be a big task.
Okay, we've got a few questions. So what I'm going to suggest is we take just 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll try and keep the answers as sharp as we can. But then maybe once we start, Xavier, you might want to revisit the chat box, and you'd be able to respond to those in the chat box as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Christina's because I thought it was a great question. Seeing the Bavarian clip, I take it you wouldn't want lynx in the wild in Scotland. You certainly wouldn't want them in the wild in Scotland if you're a wildcat.
Well, if you, I mean, that's a pet cat. There is the actual rate of predation for wildcats is very low. There's only been one record of that happening, and that's from a GPS tracking survey where they tracked hundreds of kills of roe deer, and they found amongst all that one wildcat. I think possibly there's a bias to this. I'm sorry, I'm trying to be as quick as possible. I think that pet cats it's more likely to have an impact on pet cats than on wildcats, and by doing that, then it has a beneficial impact on wildcats. I think that's quite possible.
Oh, there you go. Heard it here first. Okay, quick one then. Are Kellis cats hybrids?
Most likely. I don't think we've ever had a chance to properly do the genetics on them, but that pictures I showed it earlier of the kind of matrix of cats of all types. The best genetically scoring one we had there was a female I caught that was black, and she was 80% wildcat, and she was big. She was the biggest female I caught actually, but she was still a hybrid at the end of the day, but one of the best hybrids in terms of the genetics.
Okay. Well, Xavier's always got the tricky questions. How useful do you find the terminology Scottish wildcat used routinely in communications, especially given our management options for mainland European cats, including from England? Pragmatic, bad PR. I'll leave you to judge how far you want to expand on that answer.
I think it's useful to a certain extent in terms of PR. It helps people kind of take ownership of the species and be invested in it. We actually, and at the end of SWA and Saving Wildcats will be doing the same, use the terms the wildcat in Scotland. So that's more accurate terminology. So we are being more accurate now, but it has its uses both ways. We want to,
yeah. Is there an issue with disease transmission, Drew, from domestic cats to wild cats? Is that something we've picked up? Cat flu and
yes. Yeah, there is. It's and it's because they're basically one population. So all the way through, because you've got hybrid swarm, there's no breeding barriers. There's nothing to stop diseases passing through. So we detected FELV and FIV in wild living cats, hybrids, and in our work. Yeah.
Okay, and then I'm gonna come to Neil's one next. Could we release wildcats on an island? A bit like Anglesey for squirrels. I guess we're on an island. It's just a matter of how big your island is.
Yeah. Somebody else suggested it before as well, and I don't think you like my answer. My answer is basically it's a ground-based predator, and most islands are known for their ground nesting birds. So releasing a ground-based predator onto an island, most situations it's going to be a problem for the island. Basically, I think and for most islands actually they don't have the habitat or the area to manage a sustainable population. So
yeah,
maybe mull, but it's actually got hybrids and potentially hybrids, and it's certainly got lots of feral cats. So there's no benefit to having them in there.
And I guess the other big island is Skye, and that's now got a bridge. So forget that as an island. Okay. There's a couple of questions there, I'll maybe just direct you to within the chat, because what I'm going to suggest we do is to move on to Xavier's slides next. And again, while I'll do a wee bit of introduction for Xavier, I'm hoping he's going to be able to make his slides appear as if by magic. While he's doing that, Xavier Lambin is the final speaker tonight. Xavier's a professor at the University of Aberdeen, a fellow at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Royal Society of Biology. He's described himself as the grandfather of Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, just because I think Xavier has been involved in mink management and control in Scotland for a long time, and many predecessor projects to SISI. We might just call him the godfather, never mind the grandfather, but certainly someone whose advice we seek, and if we don't seek it, gives us advice anyway.
There's lots of things that are happening this winter that are
Someone's come off mute.
Please continue to
go back to mute, I think. Brilliant, thank you, Hilary. So yeah, if we don't seek Xavier's advice, he generally gives it to us in any case, but we appreciate it all the same. Xavier, I'm gonna shut up now, pass over to you. I'm gonna go on mute, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm checking that you can see my slides and that you can hear me. Okay, I will give you a detailed description. Let's talk about mink and how we manage mink and how we decide when we have succeeded in managing mink successfully. So I won't give you an introduction of mink, other than saying that the one on the right is a mink and the one on the left is a water vole, but they're both black. Okay, so there is a whole load of effort and taxpayer money and people's enthusiasm that is being spent around the world in controlling mink in its invasive range. This is because it's a really problematic species that is causing really quite a lot of damage to native biodiversity. And here you see a subset of the projects I'm aware of across Europe. And each focus on a different aspect of native biodiversity. They're all trying to reduce the impact of these species. And fundamentally, those projects share many similarities. We all use more or less the same techniques. We use raft, we use trap, we use mobile phone operated traps. Sometimes we use dogs and mink lure and the like. And you will try to optimize things technically. But in truth, there's quite a big difference between the objectives of the different projects and also how successful they are deemed to have been after having a run for quite a few years. That all invasive control projects have is that whenever you reduce the density of a species by culling, the survivors have a fantastic time. They can select the best habitats. They have plenty of food per unit, per individuals. And typically, the more you reduce the population, the faster the population grows on a per capita rates. And because of that, there is this feeling that mink keep coming back. The more you kill, the more come back. And it's quite depressing. It's really the challenge that all invasive control projects have. They behave like zombies. And of course, last year, more or less at this time of the year, you will remember all the horrific news that there was about those instances of infection of COVID in mink, and then infection back to mink farm workers with mink. And this led to this massive culling of 23 million mink in captivity in Denmark. And of course, the managers who did that were not too wise, and not only they put them, they buried them quite shallow, but also they put them on top of a water table. So those mink were popping back out of the ground like proper zombies. And maybe this is the kind of feelings that the people involved in mink control are also experiencing. Projects, the best one is the one that is now led by SISI, which has been going in Scotland since 1996, starting on the tiny small scale, growing to encompass the Campbell National Park, and then now this massive area of nearly 29,000 square kilometers. And this area is bounded by the sea on quite a bit of its perimeter, and that contributes very much to its success. And its current incarnation is the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative. And it has been quite a long time, and it's going on, and hopefully it looks like it's going to go on. For a time, this project had a component of applied research that enabled us to understand quite well the population that was being controlled. And there was one message that I want to convey here, is how stupendously effective mink are at dispersing and moving around the landscape. And this is really why they are such a difficult species to control, and why they're able to compensate to a degree to the control efforts. So to find that, we use DNA forensic. Many of the mink that were caught end up in our freezers. We got some tissue sample. We're able to look at the DNA, and we're able to establish who was the mother of who, where were siblings, and where were half siblings. And when any of those pairs were in different locations in the landscape, we were able to establish that one of them must have dispersed. And when we did this, we found that mink are really extraordinary dispersers. 90% of mink individuals we tracked had left their natal area. They had moved, and they do that very early in their lives. After 5-6 months of life, most mink had already dispersed. So if you want to get mink before they spread in the landscape, you really have to get either the mothers, or you have to get the young before they leave the natal den. That's the rate. This map shows the scale of dispersal and really captures the challenge that we are all facing. So in orange, you have mothers, and in blue, you have some of their offsprings. And the green lines are linking dispersal movement. And you can see basically that the Northeast Scotland area, which was a focal at the time, is crisscrossed by mink commuting from their birthplace to where they themselves reproduce. The average median dispersal is 20 kilometers. 20% of young mink had moved 80 kilometers from where they were born to where they had born. They bred successfully. And a tiny fraction moved 150 kilometers. Now, Scotland is not a very big place. And if you draw a line, a radius of 150 kilometers, you pretty much go from coast to coast. So even the huge management area of the current project is not that huge when you scale it to the dispersal ability of the mink. So I had promised in my talk abstract about flying mink. Here you have it. Mink are flying across Scotland. They don't quite go over the mountains, they go around the mountains, but they're able to crisscross pretty much every obstacle in the landscape. So given this, how do we decide what is successful? We are removing the last mink when they move so fast is extremely challenging. So what does success look like? Well, it really requires considering the relationship between the density of mink or any invasive species and the impact it has on the native fauna that you are trying to protect. So here you have terns breeding happily in the absence of mink. You have the occasional individual, here of a kittiwake being killed at a mediumish mink density, and at a very high density, you have catastrophic impact, and your native population can no longer persist. And of course, the goal of management is to move the population from the right of this axis to the left of this axis by removing mink and reducing the impact of mink. And of course, only in some circumstance where the projects are really very, very well funded and technically in the right circumstance, is it possible to contemplate eradication where the very last mink is removed, which of course is extremely challenging unless you're working on an enclosed island. So in this talk, I will take you on a very whizzing world tour of 5 projects that have been trying to deal with mink, and all of them are facing with more or less success the challenge of flying mink. So let's start in northern Spain, where here in orange you have a residual population of the world's most endangered mammal, or one of the world's most endangered mammals, the European mink, which resembles very much the American mink. And you might ask, why do we prefer one to the other one? But that's another talk. but it is surrounded not only by mink farm right in the middle of its range, but a range of population that have expanded from mink farm and are now very well established in Spain. So it's a critically endangered species. We don't like losing species. So there has been a whole number of conservation projects, many funded by EU Life, that were trying to do something about mink. What that something was not always totally well articulated. In some documents, they refer to eradicating American mink from a region, which is almost a misnomer because unless you can stop recolonization, you don't really achieve eradication. Others were trying to control the spread of mink into the region, which was, both terms were quite ill-defined. But despite that, many, many millions were spent. That project really was initially really quite ad hoc in design. They were tackling a large area, the entire range of European mink, but the funding was quite erratic, and they would only go trapping when there was funding, and there was really no monitoring that was being done to quantify the success. Trapping was being done in areas where they would find evidence of either European or American mink. They would trap them for 10 nights with 10 traps and then move on to the next place and try to do that twice per year. They were not able to do analysis during the project, but one of the students from there worked here in Aberdeen with us, and we were tasked with doing a post-hoc analysis of rather messy data. And we, I'm afraid, gave them a very painful reality check. We certainly made no new friends, but we were able to demonstrate quite conclusively that that project, the first 10 years, had achieved exactly nothing. American mink had continued spreading. The European mink range had shrunk quite a lot. And the reason for this is that basically they were not able to reduce American mink abundance sufficiently to go over the hump of that relationship between invasive abundance and invasive mink impact. In addition, American mink love the best European mink territories. So what is a good European mink territory is an excellent American mink territory. So American mink were preferentially colonizing the best part of the landscapes from where they would displace the European mink and basically take over the place. And the reverse never happened. It was purely a one-way traffic where American mink would take over the best territories. Level of control kept the population, I'm not sure if you can see in my mouse, but always in that range where dispersal recolonization by mink was well sufficient to compensate the number of mink that were ending up in the freezers. So it's fair to say this project was not a success, but then they learned from those lessons, and the most current rendition of the project, in case anybody's in the room, is much better and I'm more optimistic they will achieve something. Let's move to Scotland and to Hebrides. There it is an island, and there was a realistic prospect of achieving eradication, which, remember, is to remove the very last mink so as to make sure there is no more recolonization. It was a very well-funded project initially, partly funded with EU funding, and a team of 14 grizzly trappers with lots of experience and field skills and all the equipment that they required. And they used the technique of burying a vast number of traps in the ground and trap them repeatedly over a year using mink lure and use dogs to find dens and so on. There was no criticism whatsoever of the skill of the team involved. Of course, the problem is that there is a lot of water on the Hebrides, and they decided to put one trap every 350 meters of water body. So that's one loch, and you can see 6 traps on that loch. And then if you zoom out, you can still see that loch in the middle and quite a lot more traps. And if you zoom out again, you can see a myriad of traps on the landscape. And if you zoom out again, all those lines are not lines, they are sets of traps. So it was an enormous scale project of thousands of traps to be checked on a regular basis across an enormously challenging terrain. Again, after some years of not quite seeing the end of the project, we were tasked with analyzing those data and try to understand what were the prospects, what would it take to finish the project. And in short, we came up with this kind of graph. We're able to show that, yes, the mink population had been declining. It was well on its way to extinction. And if the trapping effort was sustained the way it was done at the time, there was an 80% probability, I insist probability, not certainty, that eradication would be by 2019, it will be in the 90% range, and so on, as you can see on the right side of this axis. Of course, this was a conditional on the trapping continuing as it was. And in truth, it has been impossible because funding ran out and the political will was not there to continue with the funding to remove the last individual to achieve eradication. But it's common across the world, be it in the Galapagos or on Gulf Island or anywhere. Removing the last few individuals is always more expensive, and it is nearly always the case that funders want to decrease their funding as opposed to ramping up the funding at the end. This is what happened here. It was a political failure. So one could say that the eradication failed to a lack of perseverance from a policy and a lack of security of funding. And of course, it is extremely hard to justify visiting 7,500 empty traps twice per year and mostly catching rats and hardly any mink. But they lack the stamina to continue that. On the plus side, there has been a spectacular recovery of the Arctic tern population that was severely affected by American mink. So from a biodiversity point of view, that's a massive success. From the political point of view, he actually made the job to find funding to finish the job harder. People have the perception that the problem is solved. No, the terns are back. No, the island is full of salt again. So it is a success. And it also shows that on this relationship between impact and density, the Arctic tern is able to tolerate a degree of mink presence. However, we all know that zombie mink will come back, and that current success is a temporary success. And the problem is still there, a solution must be found, but it's politically very challenging. Let's go across the world and just an area which is fantastic, where I've had the privilege of going, which is the Santa Cruz province in southern Patagonia on the east side of the Andes. It's a dry, windy, cold desert. And there is one of the most endangered bird species in the world, also affected by American mink. It's called the Patagonian grebe. You have seen it on the BBC show last year about mating behavior. And it's a species that is red listed with about 500 left in the world. And they live in the most extreme environment where amazingly mink always also seem to find its way. Mink on the moon. I've seen mink in what I thought was extreme environment in the Cairngorms and so on, but this does not compare at all with the kind of place where those mink are. It really does look like the moon. Well, I haven't been to the moon, but it's the way I imagine the moon. Really amazingly windswept plateau devoid of vegetation with salt lakes created by craters from volcanic bomb from the formation of the Andes that are full of birds that are normally breeding in an environment devoid of predators. So much so that most animals there have really no defense against terrestrial predators. They only look up for raptors. And this is where this endangered Patagonian grebe are nesting on lakes, on algae, floating algae on those lakes. And here we have the worst case scenario imaginable, where there is one canyon near to that one plateau where those mink are still breeding, which is just green enough for a few mink to scrape a living. It's fantastic. It's not really a very lush environment as you would expect it. And a few mink that are able to reproduce there are spreading upstream in the autumn, and they are affecting those critically endangered Patagonian grebe. This is image of one night where a single mink killed 5% of the world population by killing all its adults. Somebody has a microphone on, please. Muting, please, thank you. Can somebody mute?
Bethan, I think you've come off mute. Back to mute, please. Thank you.
Okay, I resume. Okay, so in this extreme environment where those species are normally nesting in the absence of predators, dispersing mink can cause a catastrophic mortality of species that have normally a very high longevity, very low fecundity, and really rely on trying year after year for the right conditions. And here, a very, very difficult management circumstance where you have the most extreme on this relationship between density and impact. One mink is too many mink for this species. So of course, the management challenge is enormous to try to control mink in this extremely challenging environment to access, and a team of really very dedicated conservationists funding by a wide range of funders, because these are endemic species only found there and nowhere else, are trying their very best in keeping that population alive. So So here the species has really no more refuge. Now they are really in the most extreme environment, and the conservation effort can hardly be scaled up. There is hardly any roads there. It's extremely difficult to access. But yet again, that mink dispersal ability means they could well come from lower down the valleys, where the habitat is a little bit more productive to the east, or the west and the Andes. There is a lot more food resource, including a lot of freshwater crustaceans that really are subsidizing mink very massively. Let's very quickly cross the Andes in that world tour. And here we are moving to the Los Rios region, the region of the rivers, and there is a reason for that. This is a very, very lush environment on the exposed side of the Andes, where there are rivers everywhere and fantastic postcard perfect volcanoes and the Valdivian rainforest, it's called. So this is an image of the main city. You can see the crazy network of waterways and wetlands where the land has been cleared, and the various cordilleras. So this place is a mink paradise. Not only it's full of invasive carps, but it's also full of native crayfish and various birds and various freshwater amphipods that mink are feasting on. And there's a community-based project which is very, very much has been inspired over the last nearly 10 years to the work that has been going on in Scotland. We have been in very close relationship with the Ministry of Agriculture there, and we have been put in place a project that is very much a mirror image of the Scottish project in Chile, which is no small feat given it was a dictatorship very long ago, and people did not know if their neighbors was working for the secret police until very recently. And here the main focus is largely to protect the livelihood of economically deprived farmers who are basically losing their ability to raise any chickens or ducks. Mink densities are ridiculous. You see them crossing the roads at the lights. They enter people's kitchens and houses. There are insane number of mink. So you can see here on this area, 11,000 square kilometers, the size of Grampian or even smaller. And you can see that they've caught no fewer than 7,375 mink as of last September in 5 years. This is vastly in excess than what has been caught here in Scotland, and mink keep coming. So you can see, in fact, there is very little evidence that the population is being depleted by this enormous offtake of mink by my friends who are called mink control heroes. Yet, rather surprisingly, but very, very clearly from the data, that marginal decline in mink population that has been enacted has had a very large impact on the well-being of farmers. Reducing the mink population maybe by a few percent seemed to have been sufficient to prevent mink leaving the rivers and going into farmyards and chicken coops and depriving farmers of their livelihood. And these are very poor people, many native people who are really a challenge to live on the land. So we have very wide citizen participation here. That is not only is unprecedented for Latin America, but also, of course, there is a concern of all those native bird species, which a fair few of them also endemic, and a fair few for whom you expect that this huge mink population has an enormous impact on the population size. The open question that we are still trying to work on is now how much ramping up for that already enormous offtake would be sufficient to save some of those bird species. But some of the take-home message before Callum kicks me out of the floor is that basically all the projects that I've been showing to you, no matter how large they are still quite small in relation to mink dispersal ability. So it is the case that we will always be facing recolonization from the periphery of those sites. I always blame the mink from Dundee for anything caught in northern Scotland, but the same applies in Spain. Even on Lewis and Harris, there is some mink on Lewis still, but also in all those other sites. So how do we judge success? Well, you can only judge success if you have a very clearly stated objective. And the objective really depends on the species you are trying to safeguard, or the kind of ecosystem you're trying to safeguard. And there is a clear range of species that are more or less vulnerable to mink predation. And for some of them, like the Patagonian grebe on the left, is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to prevent a single mink from slipping through. Other species, the chickens of Valdivia, but also the terns, and it seems wonderful, a degree of reduction of this invasive population that, of course, has to be sustained in perpetuity, is able to maintain the condition for persistence. The situation for the European mink looks pretty bad because there is this very strong competitive displacement of European mink from the best habitat by American mink. And I don't have the time to go into too much detail in this talk, but in all circumstances, there are habitats that are preferentially settled by new mink that replace their predecessor that are currently in our freezers. So even though there is no zombie mink, it is those colonists that are coming back and gives us this impression that mink keep coming back. And understanding where those sites are and being able to concentrate effort to those sites seem to be a potential chink in the mink armor, which otherwise we should all accept is a very, very impressive species in terms of its dispersability and very high fecundity. It's an invader, and it takes a lot of commitment to try to stop the impact. So I guess I still see today small projects, in fact, one funded this year by a LIFE project, where they're talking about a few 30 square kilometer reserves for European mink. It's largely a waste of time. If you're dealing with such a dispersive species, you work very large scale, or you don't bother, go supersize, or don't bother. Okay, so that's really my message for today's talk. I will challenge 24 minutes is not too bad, but I should of course say there's a huge number of people have been involved in this project. Project officers, conservation partners, ecologists, social scientists, computer science people, and a lot of funders, and of course hundreds and thousands of volunteers who keep giving their time because they think they can make a difference, and the difference they can make. Thank you.
Xavier, thanks very much. I mean, that's a real whistle stop tour around the world. I hope everyone's able to keep pace with that. I think on that talk alone, I think we've gone from Stornoway to Santiago and Rothes to Rio, and it's not very often you hear, I would put Rothes and Rio de Janeiro in the same sentence, but you know, I think it's fascinating to look across those projects and see the different scenarios that cause and don't cause impact. And you know, as manager of the SISI project, which has learned through various incarnations of scale of project, you know, the take-home message I think is really clear for us as we work with Xavier is, you know, big or go home, and you know, you've got to have some sort of consistency of approach. And I know when we were starting, Xavier may well remember this, I will name no names, but when we were seeking support for the previous Scottish Mink Initiative, we approached the people that had actually designed the mink raft, and they weren't keen to actually give a letter of support because they said it couldn't happen on such a scale that we were intending. The reality of it is it shouldn't happen unless you are going to go on a big scale, and I think that's the sort of commitment that's needed. So I think you know, we're pleased that we're trying to keep our end up with Xavier's critical eye and supporting critique. Anyway, a couple of questions, Xavier, have come in. One which we get asked time from Sue. We obviously know mink doesn't have many natural predators here. Has it got natural predators in its natural environment?
So there are a range of species who occasionally are eating mink, even here. White-tailed seagulls had a bunch of mink on their nests. We have various anecdotes of occasional otters killing mink, but there's always a very big difference between a few individual mink going down the gullet of a predator and the mink population being suppressed. So there is predators. Anything who can catch a mink, a fox, a dog, would not say no. Of course they would, but it's nowhere near sufficient to depress the population. Not least because that's so fecund. They can have up to 8, 9 kits every year, and also whenever there is a vacancy, there is a surplus mink from elsewhere coming in. In Chile, puma have been seen to eat mink. Some raptors can eat mink, but again, it's not sufficient to reduce population.
Yeah, Neil's suggest. I mean, he's spotted a mink on the Allen Water in Dunblane, and somewhat inevitably just outside the patch. We're looking at that, but I have just put a link up for anyone that does spot mink in Scotland, where they can report it to us. And from the records there, we can act upon the ones that are within the project area. And if we have other partners that are dealing with mink outside the project area, we can pass those on. So if you do happen to spot one, there's an easy place to tell us about it, and we'll do our best to make something of it. Question from Rue. Yeah, how do we convince others that the cost of complete eradication is the long-term most cost-effective option in all situations? Question mark. Would an economic study be worthwhile? I think this is sort of touche moment for Rue, isn't it? This is response to you.
Payback, yes.
Yeah. So tell your book, Xavier.
So I've had a long debate with a good friend and colleague, Tony Martin, who has removed rats and mice from South Georgia, and who is now involved in a massive project in Norfolk. And his view is that it's eradication or nothing. You know, we work on a paper together where he was trying to make the case, and in the end, we couldn't agree because I feel like too many areas where we lack technical solutions. Now, if you could go everywhere and get to the last rocky, scary, where mink can breed, we might possibly do it. I think what has been taking place on the Lewis, where they had a crack team with a lot of resource and ribs and zodiacs and thousands of traps and dogs and everything, is quite a lesson. Or it's very hard, or you would take a long time, and tools that we currently lack to get those last few mink. So in theory, of course, it is better to spend a big whack of money once than spending a little bit in perpetuity. It doesn't take a model to show that. We don't have a solution. So which is why I think using volunteers and all the kind of excellent value for money that SISI delivers, a bargain, huge reward for peanuts, is one way to do it, not least because you engage people and you have them work on more than one species, and you can use, there's multiple benefits. You don't need to remove the last mink, you don't need to go crazy chasing the last dispersing mink. No, 1 or 2 mink is not much worse than a stoat or an otter. What is bad is established mink. So I'm afraid in the same way as we take down a garbage down the road, or we've learned to recycle our glass bottles, it is possible to change people's behavior for the long term, and without adding too much of a burden to people. They can do just enough to keep what is dear to them. So that's a very long answer to your impossible question. But then you get to answer my question later on. So.
Okay, what we got? Yeah, here's another curveball then. You got any thoughts on gene drive, Xavier, for mink? I think it's quite a long one, so I'll leave you to have a bunch of that.
Yeah, I am personally terrified of gene drive. Now, we had many bright ideas that have gone terribly wrong, and I've yet to be convinced that this one is not of such ideas that will go terribly wrong and move from mink to another species. And even though people say, they are antidote, or you could reverse an unplanned disaster. We've said that so many times. So people are talking about that for some Antarctic islands and some mice, but we have seen with a rabbit hemorrhagic disease experiment in Australia, it didn't take very long for farmers to get hold of the virus and move them across the world. So if you release gene drive somewhere, we would have to be so very sure that nobody will take the virus or whatever the vector we're going to have and move them to mink in its native range. So terribly cautious about it. We need a magic bullet, but one that's not going to jump and kill your native species along the way.
Yeah, I kind of share your caution, actually. Just going to pick a couple of the comments, and I'm conscious we're a wee bit over time, but James is on about numerous reports of mink at Hopeman Buckhead, which is in the CC area, and local Facebook wildlife groups encouraging folk not to report these. We do knock over mink at Hopeman and Buckhead, and sometimes in quite rapid numbers. I think at one point we had half a dozen in half a dozen days from the same trap, day after day consecutively. But maybe James could go a bit rogue on the Facebook groups and just tell us where they are, and then we'll try and get out and catch them. Question on the mink project on Hebrides, Xavier. I've got no knowledge of this. Have we done any genetic work to determine if they're trap evaders or new invaders out there?
No, we haven't done genetic work, but we have plenty of anecdotes or impressions from the local project manager, and he's quite convinced that it was a combination of bad weather that made it impossible to reach some islands. So doing field work in the Western Isles offshore is terribly challenging. We also know there always were a few mink remaining on the Uist, and hence the scope for some reinvasion. There was not enough staffing to do both finish Uist off and do Lewis at the same time. So they had planned to do them sequentially, which was always a very risky strategy. So the short answer is we don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if they moved across. I mean, the Sound of Harris is a tough place to cross, but then quite a few mink might well drawn, but it only takes 1 or 2 to make it, and you have a new population. They also go on fishing boats quite often. They've been seen on many fishing boats. Sorry.
An observation from Owen about the contribution pine marten can make in displacing mink, which I think is probably increasingly well recognised, but they ain't a solution to the problem. They can lend a helping hand, but they're not the magic bullet either, I don't think. What else have we got? Yeah, a question from Owen about tampering of traps by activists. We occasionally find that it's not a matter of activists tampering with traps or rafts. It's more just people who are up to no good in general, and that tends to just be around population centres. We find it impossible pretty much to put any kit out in Inverness because it ends up in a tree somewhere. So there is certainly a thinking when we're going out setting rafts and traps to try and keep them away from the public eye, and for all sorts of reasons, but certainly vandalism is one. We have had them vandalised down at reed beds just outside Perth as well, and a number of other places. It's just a sort of a fact of the matter. We have had very few people have stuck their hand up to claim to be a friend of the mink. We have had the press trying to make an issue of that, gotten quotes from PETA to go alongside work that we were doing on control. And the response to that was we had another 15 people signed up to become volunteers in the project. So rather than sort of generate a negative response to our work, it actually seemed to generate a little clutch of people who were interested in helping. So I think, those that are involved in mink control, we're aware that it's not a nice job particularly, but we're also convinced that it's a necessary job, and therefore we stick at it, and we're clear about what we do. We kill mink, and that's what we're trying to achieve here, and I think there's no point hiding around by that. But to date, Owen, we haven't had too many people really taking issue with it. We did have someone suggest we could catch them and donate them to a zoo. Was the nicest incarnation of that sort of approach. Okay. I think we've got ourselves through the questions now. So rather than prolong this any further, I'd just like to say a few things. Firstly, apologies to everyone who's here and to Craig for the technical gremlin at the beginning, and thanks to Craig for so impressively working through the presentation regardless. I've said earlier we'll put the slides up on the website when we put this recording up so people can see it. Thanks to Rue and Xavier for saving my bacon for the rest of the presentation sessions by having slides that appeared. And thanks everyone for taking the time out their evening tonight to come along. I think we were up about 70 people or so there tonight at one point in time. So thank you very much. There's been 2 or 3 links I've posted into the chat box. If people want to have a nosy around on the websites for the Squirrel project or the Wildcat project or the SISI project, indeed, you can find us there. Without further ado, then just leave and say thanks again, everyone, for coming along. I hope you found it interesting. We may try and do this again if I can muster up the courage to take on Zoom for another time. But in the meantime, thanks so much for your time, everyone, and particularly to speakers. And good evening and good night. Thank you.